Good mythical afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. Ayala with another video lesson for you. This is 14.6, Reconstruction and New Amendments. As always, please make sure that you're listening to the information being presented. So please make sure you put the music off, you put down the YouTube, you minimize anything that you're watching or listening to, and get away from any distractions. Make sure you are also writing down all this information so that you can be prepared for the next assessment, quiz, test, exam, whatever it may be. So sit back, relax, and let's get started. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the idea of Reconstruction. And this is the time period when the United States is trying to readmit the southern states that seceded from the Union back into the U.S. And this was controlled by the president, not Congress, as part of his military powers. Since the Confederacy were states that were under rebellion by the Union's perspective, excuse me, it was part of his power as commander-in-chief to control this, not Congress. We have a new president, number 17, Andrew Johnson. He's a Democrat, and Lincoln chose him as his running mate for his second term because of the idea of wanting to show unity among the different political parties. And the first thing that occurs during Reconstruction is a brand new federal agency is created, known as the Freedmen's Bureau, and their goal was to help these brand new freed slaves. They try to help them integrate into our society, to be able to vote, read, have hospitals, and have someone to help them learn how to become, or I should say how to assimilate into our society appropriately. From there, we have the radicals and Republicans in Congress, which were the far left side of the Republicans at this time, who believed in equality among the different races, which was considered a radical perspective at that time. So they put through three major amendments. They have the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States unless it's used as punishment, for example, in prison or jail. They passed the 14th Amendment, which gives all people born in the U.S. citizenships and make it illegal for the states to discriminate based on race. So what this does, this gives these newly freed slaves citizenship automatically because they were born on American soil. This is one of the ways that you are known if you're a citizen. You have the law of the blood. If one of your family members is a citizen, you automatically get American citizenship. And the other one is, to be a natural born citizen, is the law of the land, which is through the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment also makes it illegal for states to actually discriminate based on one's ethnicity or race. So this is why it's illegal to kick people out just because of their race, their ethnicity, or actually who they are. They also push through the 15th Amendment, which gives African American men the right to vote. This will upset these white women in the United States because they've been fighting for the right to vote since the United States was actually founded. And they're like, these brand new citizens get the right to vote, but we don't. So this kind of really upsets that group of people. They're like, come on, we've been fighting for this, and we don't get it yet. That's not what they considered fair. But women will get the right to vote, as in the 19th Amendment. So, meanwhile, we have the black codes in the South, which were laws specifically designed against ex-slaves and begin to spread throughout the South. One black code was known as the Sunset Law, which stated that certain groups of people were not allowed in certain parts of town after the sunset, and also the idea of segregation began to spread, or separating people based on race. So the radical Republicans wanted to also help rebuild the South and the North's image. They want to support these ex-slaves, and they want to help integrate these ex-slaves into American society so that they are able to survive and be successful. So these radicals in Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which guaranteed African Americans the right to vote. Not only do we have the amendment that guarantees it, we also have a civil rights amendment that guarantees this. One of the parts of Reconstruction was that all these southern governments had to have new constitutions before they were allowed to be integrated back into the Union. And these new constitutions must not have anything that separates people based upon race, or anything that separates people based on their status of being an ex-slave or a non-ex-slave, aka a white person in the South. This will later be repealed after Reconstruction is stopped. Then there was a major rumor that kept going around the African American community at this time that they would receive 40 acres and a mule to start their life as a freedman or woman. This was completely false. This was something that Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass were thinking about, but after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and the presidency goes to the Democrats at this time, that they stopped this idea and kind of nipped it in the bud because they didn't want to take land also away from these southern plantation holders, because they already took their property, their slaves, but they don't want to take their land also because they thought that this would upset the southern whites, especially the wealthy southern whites, quite a bit. So a lot of these ex-Confederates in the South banded together and they created secret terrorist organizations like the KKK or the Ku Klux Klan. And yes, this is a terrorist organization because they try to use terror, torture, and lynching and killings to try to make a political change. And that's what a terrorist is someone who uses terror and violence to try to control. And they use these killings and these lynchings and torture to scare these ex-slaves and their white supporters away from voting. They wanted a way to try to scare them away from the voting booth. And this did help some Southern Democrats in the South gain power. Because with all the African American men who were voting, all these Northerners who came down, known as carpetbaggers, to try to help and rebuild the South, they wanted to scare them, because these African Americans are likely to vote Republican at this time. In modern day, they vote Democrat. Why? Because the Democratic and Republican parties flip in the 1960s, their political platforms. But anyway, the first Grand Wizard, his name was Nathaniel Bedford Forrest. I always say to myself, the KKK is like a racist D&D group. They have these group, their leaders called the Grand Wizard, and then they have like the first Cyclops. I have no idea why they chose that. I think it's quite silly, but themselves, the KKK, is quite terrifying in my perspective. So Andrew Johnson is the first president to be impeached. And really what this was is because he fought against the radical Republicans in Congress. He was dragged through these amendment processes and these protections, more or less kicking and screaming. In 1867, Johnson was impeached for breaking what was known as the Tenure of Office Act. More or less, Johnson fired someone who was high up in the executive branch without informing Congress of why, and that was considered illegal. So he was impeached, but not removed, because he was actually acquitted by one single vote. So if one more person voted against Johnson, he would have been removed from office. But because that one vote went for what said that he was acquitted, or it didn't really matter, that he was not removed from office. Then we have the next election, and we have a new president. His name is Ulysses S Grant. He's the 18th president. He's a Republican. He was a very interesting fella. Like we stated during the Civil War, the thing that he was best at was fighting. And he also was known to the Southern African, to these ex-slaves, as the man who helped free the slaves. But he has some problems. Though Grant was not corrupt himself, he does have one of the most corrupt administrations in American history. Probably the second or third up to at this moment. And the one thing that he's known for is fighting against the KKK, and he actually ends up crushing them and makes the KKK go back into hiding. And this is something that happens quite often in American history. The Ku Klux Klan will get a whole bunch of members, they get really loud, they start, scaring minority groups and people who weren't like them, or WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Then they would be scared back into hiding, disappear for about 20, 30 years, and then reappear. And it keeps happening over and over and over. Then we had the Panic of 1873, and what this happens is that banks gave out bad loans, and this caused a run in the banks. And many of these banks failed, and even the railroad companies that were building the railroads all across the nation, because remember, industrialization is still occurring in the background, actually went broke. And because the Union and the United States itself was having a lot of economic trouble, the nation gets tired of Reconstruction. The Northerners are like, why should our prosperity pay for the South to rebuild after the Civil War? And the Southerners were like, why should the Northerners be telling us how to rebuild our part of the nation? This is our area, not theirs, through states' rights. So what happens is Reconstruction ends at the Compromise of 1877 when President Hayes becomes the 19th president. He's a Republican. And he makes a deal with the Democrats in Congress and the Southerners, saying, I will become president Rutherford Hayes will become president if the South gets some things. So first, Reconstruction's ended. The government removes the troops from the South because the South still had troops there to try to protect these ex-slaves. The government will now give land, grants, and loans for these railroads to continue their construction across the United States, so it makes the wealthy class excited. Southern officials will also receive federal grants and funding for construction improvement projects. Prior, the national government chose what each state should do with the money. Now they're just giving bulk sums of money to the southern states, and then the states themselves get to choose what to do with that money. Some did quite well, like Texas, while others did not do very well, like Mississippi or Louisiana. Hayes would also appoint a Democrat to his cabinet, and that the Democrats promised to respect its African-American civil and political rights, which they will not throughout this time. And then when the Republicans and Democrat parties flip in the 1960s with what was known as the Southern Strategy, the Republicans in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s will do the same thing. They will try to suppress African-American and minority rights. So, the good thing is now we're officially done for all the things of this school year. So, as always, don't forget to be awesome.